Hey everyone, and welcome to the last lesson of Unit 2 Biology. In this concluding video, we are going to be discussing evolutionary explanations for behavior. To begin with, let's discuss the theory of evolution. Evolution is basically the process by which a population's gene pool changes throughout time from generation to generation. The theory of evolution has four main parts. Firstly, organisms are driven by the need to survive and reproduce as their instincts, because the main motive of organisms is to transfer their genes to their offspring. Organisms have differential fitness, meaning that some are better adapted to an environment than others. For example, in the case of the peppered moths during the Industrial Revolution, the darker moths were able to better camouflage to their darker environment due to the pollution compared to lighter colored moths. As a result, they were better adapted and had better fitness than the white moths. Third, the best adapted organisms will survive in the environment. This is a concept called the survival of the fittest. In the case of the peppered moths, the black moths were the most fit during the Industrial Revolution. And lastly, better adapted organisms will survive and therefore pass on their traits because they will be able to reproduce, while others who are not as fit will not pass on. So that means our gene pool is going to strengthen because we're only going to have the fittest left. This process is called natural selection, coined by our friend Charles Darwin. So there are many different evolutionary explanations in psychology, and there have been many attempts to explain different psychological traits. So we've tried to explain mental disorders, altruism, emotion, and cognition, attachment, as seen in Harlow's study, which is a really interesting study, which you should definitely look at. Harlow study 1958, which looks into the attachment in monkeys. And we can also attempt to explain the theory of mind through evolution by being able to recognize the beliefs and intentions of others, which actually plays a role in evolution. As primitive humans, we actually needed to do this in order to communicate in a social sense. So the main study we're going to be talking about is an evolutionary explanation for disgust. And this study is by Curtis Auger, I think it's actually supposed to be Auger, and Raby, conducted in 2004. I think the study is really easy to remember and very effective if you're trying to evaluate it. So please look into the study and commit it to memory, as Mr. Dunlop would say. So basically in the study, researchers hypothesized 5 separate sub-hypotheses, and they basically said that disgust should be felt more strongly with disease salient stimuli, meaning that the stimuli looks really organic and like resembling blood and bodily secretions like vomit. So disgust should be felt more strongly with that than, like, for example, like the image in page 112, like a blue thing, because it's not really disease-y looking. It's more of an artificially synthesized looking stimuli. So the second hypothesis is that disgust should operate similarly across cultures because disgust is a universal feeling. The third hypothesis is that disgust should be more pronounced in females because they have offspring to protect, and they would have potentially have an organism in their womb to also look out for. And fourth, disgust should weaken as individual reproductive potential declines with age because you wouldn't really care as much, because once you reproduce, your purpose in life is basically done for in an evolutionary sense. The last one is that disgust should be stronger in contact with strangers because people who are not closely related to you would seem dangerous and foreign, like a pathogen. And basically in the study, they used a survey method with 40,000 participants. Now that's a good pointer for an evaluation, good sample size. They used a survey method and asked different questions, and the results supported all of the hypotheses. The results supported all of the hypotheses above, showing that disgust is indeed an evolutionary response that reduces our risk of disease and enables us to survive. So next time you're disgusted by something randomly lying on the floor, or disgusted by an unattractive mate, you now know that it is for the reason of your survival. Now let's get into some criticisms of evolutionary explanations in psychology. The first one being massive modularity versus neuroplasticity. So the evolutionary explanations usually assume that the brain has modules, which is meaning that it is divided into parts. And this is opposed by neuroplasticity, meaning that the brain can constantly change. Evolutionary explanations assume this modularity and that the brain is a product of evolutionary processes. However, we know that neuroplasticity is actually indeed true because we have seen it from different studies, like Merznick's, where in the owl monkey, they cut off a finger, and the absent area in the brain that actually controlled that finger was actually divided into the other finger. So we know that neuroplasticity is actually true. So this is basically a criticism because it's assuming something that may not be always true. And there are also speculations about the environment because evolution is different with different environments because our environmental pressures actually cause evolution. So we have that criticism. And also we have the testability of evolutionary explanations because we really don't know how to test it because it's a very long-term process that's very, very intricate, and we can't really replicate that in a laboratory setting. So we're usually not exactly sure about it. We can for causation. Fourth, we have assumptions about the linearity of development. Evolution is not always a serial process, one after another, continuous. It's really messy and multifaceted, meaning that there can be different nuances to it. Lastly, we have cultural variation because different cultures have different views on evolution and different environmental influences depending on the culture there is. So this can, in fact, affect evolution and the evolutionary explanations in psychology. Lastly, we have adaptation versus other evolutionary mechanisms. So it's very hard to distinguish between actual adaptation and other processes such as genetic drift, which is basically a random variation in genotype that occurs naturally. For example, as a result of a natural disaster, a bunch of the genes in the gene pool might be reduced. This is actually hard to distinguish between actual evolution through natural selection. And you can also have spandrels, which is a byproduct of evolution, which is unrelated to the actual evolutionary process, but is just something that is a result of other evolutionary processes that just left this feature behind. For example, the small arms of T-Rex dinosaurs. And lastly, I want to leave you with this. Evolutionary psychology remains a very promising field, and I personally am very interested in this, and I highly, highly, highly recommend that you memorize this study, which is an evolutionary explanation for disgust. This is very interesting, very mind-opening, very easy to remember, perfect for SAQs and LEQs, so please. And see you next lesson where we will be moving on to Unit 3, Cognitive Approach to Behavior. Thank you all.